Hi everyone. Today we're talking about the uprisings and music of Japan and Korea. So while I was reading these articles and thinking about how they're all connected, I came up with two questions about these articles. So how does music function in politics and social movements? And what impact does the government have on that musical function? So the overarching theme of the articles in this module is music's political function in Japan and Korea. As we've talked about in the past couple of weeks and seen with our readings about music in China and protest songs around the world, music can have a very large impact on bringing people together and spreading messages about political views. Both Japan and South Korea have undergone shifts in their government and various demonstrations to call for change and democracy. But in both countries, the government also has a high level of control over what media is allowed to be consumed by the people. So as I said, protest music can have a deep impact on unifying people and spreading awareness. In Korea, we see this with the anti-government protests and demonstrations, and in Japan with the anti-nuclear power demonstrations. The governments in both countries have ways to silence people. We see the banning of certain music in Korea, like Korean rock, and the very strict censorship in Japan. So both countries highly discourage musicians and people in general from criticizing the government. This can result in loss of income, gigs, and future projects for musicians. So there are two major moments of uprising, one in each country. There's the Gwangju Uprising, known as 518 in Korea. This was an organization of students on a college campus, and they were protesting against martial law. It was an anti-government protest, and there were over 100,000 demonstrators over the week that this uprising took place. At the climax of this uprising, protesters were fired at, beaten, raped, and killed by the government, and it's estimated that around 2,000 people died during this uprising. It also came to light later that the government had ordered for civilians to be fired at. And then we see the triple disaster known as 311 in Japan, which was the earthquake, tsunami, and then nuclear meltdown in Fukushima. Citizens began to get very upset and protest against nuclear power and calling on the Japanese government to look at alternative power sources. So next I am going to talk about how music has changed in each of these countries. So we'll start with Korea. In the 1960s, in between the 1960s and 70s, the president decided that Korean rock was hippie music and it was not suitable for society. He began censoring popular music to preserve sound culture in Korea. So this kind of music, Korean rock, which before had been influenced by American rock, and people really liked it, but now it was being turned into this kind of hippie culture that was not suitable for society. So musicians took Korean rock underground. And towards 1980, when the Gwangju Uprising happened, something called Minjunggayo, or protest songs, became very popular, and they became a symbol of pro-democratic movement against the authoritarian government. So these songs were being written and created to bring attention to big social issues in Korea, like the movement for workers' rights, the unification of North and South Korea, criticism of the United States, human rights, and most importantly, political change. So as this music is now becoming popular underground, Korean rock started to become popular at colleges with the Korean youth. So this kind of rock was not so much that hippie culture, but it was more clean cut and didn't really have any social or political ties. It was more just simple. So after this, Minjunggayo became less popular as the government started to change and lean towards more of a democracy. So musicians at this time had to adjust to public tastes and what people liked. So as this continues, Later on in 2002, we see the World Cup where Korea and Japan both make it to the finals, and Korean rock starts to resurface into the mainstream, but is now given a patriotic twist and started to bring together the young and old generations in Korea to unite and in this like social fight against Japan in the World Cup. So this music started out as, you know, something that was well liked and was well received by Korea, and then it turned into hippie music, and then after the uprising, it turned into this protest, anti-government kind of style, and then we see it come back in the colleges and with student music, but with less political ties. And then it turns into this patriotic movement. So it really has taken quite a bit of change over the last couple of decades, which is really interesting to see. And then next, let's go to Japan. As author Grunbaum states, he's talking about the famous Japanese reggae artist known as Rankin Taxi. He states that Japanese prefer nonsense songs to message songs. So their music, they want their music to be light and fun and not about particular political or social messages. So the media, like radio and TV and record labels, refused to play or release these anti-nuclear songs that became popular after the Fukushima meltdown. Now, these media outlets resisted playing anti-nuclear songs for two major reasons. Something called fuyo higai, or damage from rumors. They wanted to prevent and avoid this. And the reason they may have wanted to avoid this is because many of these outlets had monetary ties to nuclear power companies and did not want to lose the funding they received from these companies. So there are three levels of censorship in Japan that the author Manabe talks about. So the first level is prior restraint, which means that a record company may refuse to sign an artist or prevent a signed musician from making a recording about anti-nuclear stances, or they may refuse to release a recording. So some musicians went and released their own recordings without the blessing of their record label. So prior restraint tends to actually be the most common in the Japanese music industry. The next is restriction of release. So this does not take certain protest songs off of the market, but it limits the audience that it can reach. And then the last is suppression through government or legal banning of a recording. Like I said, in Japan, most censorship is prior restraint because artists know what can happen to them if they release an anti-nuclear song. It can result in loss of income, it can result in loss of gigs, and it can also prevent artists from getting future projects to make money. So this can greatly impact their income and their livelihood. So most artists just exercise restraint on their own instead of risking their lives and careers to make a statement. Then Manabe also talks about how anti-nuclear protest music can take place in 4 spaces, and it's not really on radio or TV, as those tend to be geared more towards the older generation. So anti-nuclear protest music can take place in one of 4 spaces. So cyberspace, or the internet, demonstrations and festivals, and then in recordings. So the reason that anti-nuclear music can function in these spaces, the author Manabe talks about, there are 2 reasons. So if a performance is live with the audience in the same space as the artist, the performer can gauge the feelings of the audience and explain what they mean in their music to avoid misunderstandings. So they can just see how people are feeling and know if it's a good time to talk about these social issues or not. And then on the other hand, when someone is listening on the internet or to a recording, these people are listening privately, so they can have their own reactions without fear of having the government get involved. So it seems that these are safer avenues than trying to push the music from a record label, both for musicians and for the listeners, so that they still have the freedom to think about these things and talk about these things, but they are less likely to face government lashbacks. So that is all. I am curious to know what everybody thinks. Something that I thought about was, if I was a musician that was putting out protest songs or anti-government or anti-nuclear music, would I be willing to risk my career to do that? And I'm curious what everyone else thinks. I think it would be really difficult to make that choice because it's important to talk about these social injustices and things that are wrong, and raise awareness. But on the other hand, it would be very tricky to give up income and livelihood just to make a statement. So I'm curious what you all think. Here are my references, and I look forward to our discussions. Thank you.